She was the librarian who never forgot a face, or a feeling. One quiet evening, under shelves of forgotten stories, she looked at me and whispered, "Let's file this under secrets." That's when I knew, this wasn't just about books anymore. The library had always been a quiet place for me, not just in sound, but in feeling. It was where I escaped the rush of everything outside, the noise, the deadlines, the endless small talk that always felt a little too loud. But that afternoon, the quiet carried something else, something alive. Golden light slanted through the tall windows, dust drifting like tiny, weightless secrets in the air. I had wandered between the shelves without much of a plan, my fingers tracing along worn spines, their faded titles catching the light here and there. That's when I noticed her. She moved with a kind of calm that didn't ask for attention, but somehow demanded it anyway. Mid-40s, perhaps, with a presence both elegant and grounded. Her hair was pulled back loosely, a few strands catching the light as she bent to adjust a stack of books. The click of her low heels against the polished floor echoed softly, steady, like a heartbeat in the hush. For a moment, I almost kept walking, just another passerby, another anonymous visitor. But there was something in the way she paused, glancing over her shoulder. Her eyes found mine, just for a second. And in that second, I forgot what I had come here for. It wasn't just her appearance, though there was an undeniable grace in the way she carried herself. It was her expression, composed, yes, but with the faintest trace of a smile tugging at the corner of her lips. The kind of smile that said she'd already noticed me, maybe even before I noticed her. I turned my gaze to the shelves again, pretending to search for a book I didn't need. Yet, I felt her presence as clearly as the soft sun on my back. She moved along the aisle, fingertips brushing along the edges of the hard covers, a gesture so simple, yet so oddly intimate. I wondered what it would be like to be that book, to feel her touch pause there for a second longer. The air smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood, a scent I'd grown to love. But now it mixed with something else, a trace of lavender, subtle and fleeting, carried as she passed a few steps behind me. I thought about saying something, a casual remark about the weather, or asking if she had a recommendation. But the moment felt too delicate for words. Instead, I just stood there, listening to the soft shuffle of her movements, the quiet authority of someone who belonged entirely to this place. It was only when she finally turned down another aisle that I let out the breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. That was the first time I saw her, not just as the librarian behind the desk, but as a presence that shifted the entire rhythm of the room. I didn't know her name yet. I didn't know why her glance felt like it had placed a bookmark in me, somewhere deep. All I knew was that this library had always been a place of stories. And now, for the first time, it felt like one had just begun, that I hadn't planned on coming back so soon, but the memory of her lingered longer than I expected. A few days later, I found myself in the same library aisle, this time pretending to search for something obscure, something that might make sense of why I kept thinking about a woman I barely knew. The shelves whispered their usual hush, but I could feel her presence again before I even saw her. A faint trace of lavender drifted past me, and there she was, sliding a book back into place with the kind of care people rarely give to things these days. Looking for something in particular? Her voice carried a low, warm lilt, professional, but not distant. The kind of voice that draws you a little closer without asking you to. I cleared my throat, caught between honesty and pretense. Something on modern history, I think. But I'm a bit lost in the maze. She arched one brow, amused but subtle. Modern history? That's ambitious for a late afternoon. Her fingers trailed along the spines as she moved beside me, scanning titles with practiced ease. Her sleeve brushed against my wrist, just a whisper of contact, enough to send a ripple through my stillness. "This one," she murmured, stopping in front of a higher shelf. She rose slightly on her toes, hand reaching for a dark green hardcover tucked between heavier volumes. For a moment, her balance wavered, and I instinctively reached up too, my hand hovering just beneath hers. We almost touched, almost. The space between our fingers felt charged, suspended in that small breath of air. She glanced at me, a quick side look, the corner of her lips tugging into a half-smile. "Some secrets," she said softly, holding the book out to me, "are best kept on the top shelf." Her tone wasn't just about the book anymore. There was a tease there, a playful glint beneath the polished composure. I accepted the book, though I hardly noticed the title. My fingers brushed the edge of her thumb as I took it, and she didn't pull away too quickly. The library lights hummed above us, the late sun fading to a warmer glow. Somewhere in the distance, a student coughed, the sound reminding me that the world still existed beyond this quiet aisle. But here, now, it felt like only the two of us. "Is it a good one?" I asked, just to keep her near a little longer. Her eyes lingered on mine for a heartbeat. "Depends what you're looking for. Some readers want facts, others come for the stories hiding between them." She turned slightly, gathering a few stray papers from the shelf end. The movement sent a strand of her hair slipping forward, and she tucked it behind her ear with a faint sigh. I held the book tighter than I meant to. Not because of what was written inside it, but because of what had just passed between us. A touch that never quite became a touch. A sentence that sounded like a secret. The rain started just as the library began to thin out. I remember the sound first, soft at first, then steadier, drumming against the wide old windows like fingers tapping on glass. It was the kind of rain that blurred the city outside and made the inside feel even more like its own world. By early evening, there were only a handful of people left. One by one, they drifted out, umbrellas blooming like dark flowers in the gray street. I stayed. Maybe for the book I wasn't really reading, maybe for the quiet I had started to crave. And then there was her. She moved between the tables, collecting stray returns, her steps unhurried, her focus entirely on the small rituals that kept this place breathing. Tonight, her hair looked a shade darker with the rain, a soft wave curling near her temple. She carried a cardigan loosely over her shoulders, practical, simple, but somehow elegant, like everything about her. "Staying late?" she asked when she passed my table. Her voice was lower this time, less formal than before. A question, yes, but also an acknowledgement, that we were the last two left in a space that suddenly felt more intimate than public. I nodded. "Seems like the weather wants to keep me here." She gave a small smile, one that didn't quite reach her lips fully, but flickered in her eyes. "It has that effect." For a while, we said nothing more. I turned a page, though I couldn't recall a single word I'd read. She sat down a few feet away at the long wooden table, sorting catalog cards into neat rows. The soft rustle of paper was the only sound besides the rain. Every so often, she would pause, glance at a note scribbled in the margin of some forgotten record, and tuck it into a different pile. I found myself watching the small movements of her hands, the way her fingers brushed an edge to realign it, the slight tap she made with her thumb when satisfied. At one point, she leaned closer, too close for me not to feel the faint warmth of her presence. Our shoulders touched, just barely. A fleeting thing. But I didn't move, and neither did she. "Look at this," she whispered, sliding a yellowed slip of paper toward me. It was a handwritten note, decades old, left tucked inside an old poetry collection. A confession, maybe, or a quote about love, half-faded, signed only with initials. "People leave pieces of themselves behind," she said softly. I met her gaze then. Something in it felt familiar, though I couldn't say why. Not just kindness. Not just curiosity. Something quieter, and much harder to name. The rain kept falling. The clock ticked toward closing. But in that shared silence, it felt like time wasn't quite moving in the same way anymore. The lights flickered just after sunset. It was brief, a quick pulse of darkness that rippled across the library's rows of shelves like a held breath. Then, just as suddenly, the glow returned, soft and muted, casting longer shadows than before. She was a few steps away, sorting a set of returned books on a rolling cart. The moment the lights dimmed, her head turned, her eyes meeting mine through the narrow aisle. For a fraction of a second, there was a shared pause, two people caught in a hush that didn't quite belong to either of them. When the lights steadied again, she exhaled a small laugh. "Old building," she murmured, brushing a stray strand of hair from her cheek. "It likes to remind us who's in charge." I smiled. "Keeps things interesting." She moved closer then, pushing the cart forward until it rested at the end of my table. "Interesting isn't always what libraries are known for," she said, her voice light but carrying something beneath it. Something that made the air feel thinner, just for a moment. As she adjusted the stack, her hand slipped slightly on the metal edge of the cart. Reflexively, she steadied herself, her fingers catching my forearm as she found her balance. The contact was brief, no more than a second, but the warmth of it lingered, precise and unmistakable. Her fingers didn't grip, they rested, as though testing the space between hesitation and permission. My pulse quickened, not from surprise, but from how natural it felt. Like it had been waiting to happen. She noticed, of course. Her eyes flicked down, just for a heartbeat, then back up to meet mine. There was no apology in her gaze. Only a quiet, unspoken question. "I suppose," she said softly, "some connections, you don't catalog. You just keep them safe." The words hung there. Neither of us moved to fill the silence after them. The rain outside had slowed to a faint drizzle, the library's clock ticked on, steady and oblivious. I cleared my throat, trying to summon a smile. "So what do you do with those? The ones that don't belong on any shelf?" She gave a small, knowing shrug. "You make space for them. Somewhere only you can find." And then she turned, slowly, deliberately, back to her cart, leaving her hand to trail lightly across the edge of my sleeve as she passed. Not a full touch. Just enough to leave a trace. The aisle seemed longer after she walked away. The air smelled faintly of rain-damp paper and that same lavender I had noticed before. My fingers rested on the spot where hers had been, feeling the echo of that moment like a note still vibrating after the sound has gone. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't even a promise. But it was something real, and for now, that was enough. A week passed before I found an excuse to return. The rain had gone, the evenings were warmer, and yet the quiet of that library had settled somewhere inside me. I carried a book under my arm, unfinished, though not for lack of time. If I was honest, I hadn't brought it back because of the story inside. I brought it back because of her. She was behind the counter when I walked in, her head bent slightly as she scribbled a note on a slip of paper. The faint scratch of her pen stopped as the door clicked shut behind me. She looked up, and that same subtle recognition passed between us, unspoken, but unmistakable. "You didn't finish it, did you?" Her tone wasn't accusing. It was, amused. Warm. I placed the book gently on the desk. Maybe I liked the idea of having a reason to return. Her fingers lingered on the cover as she drew it toward her. "You always leave the best chapters unread," she said softly, as if the book were a mirror for something neither of us wanted to name too directly. For a moment, neither of us moved. The library was nearly empty, only a faint murmur of pages turning in the far corner. The scent of coffee drifted from the small staff table nearby, faintly bitter, comforting, familiar. She reached for her mug, paused, then set it aside as though deciding something quietly. "Sometimes," she said, eyes still on the book, "people stop halfway because they're not sure if the ending will be worth it." Her words landed between us, heavier than they appeared. I felt them more than I understood them, like a thread tugged gently from somewhere I hadn't realized was loose. "What about you?" I asked. "Do you always finish what you start?" She gave a slow, thoughtful smile, one that didn't quite hide the flicker of something else behind it. "Not always. But I keep the ones that matter close, even if they stay unfinished for a while. Her hand rested on the edge of the desk, fingers just a few inches from mine. I hesitated, then let my own drift close enough for our knuckles to nearly touch. Not a bold gesture. Just a quiet alignment, like two bookmarks waiting on the same page. She didn't move away. The clock above us ticked softly, the room wrapped in that hushed glow of evening, warm, muted, steady. I realized then that what I wanted wasn't answers, or even certainty. It was this, the pause before something real begins. She closed the book, her fingers still pressing lightly on the cover. "Next time," she said, her voice low, "you should read past the halfway point." I nodded, the corner of my mouth lifting. Next time. And for the first time, I felt the pull not of the story in my hand, but of the one unfolding right there at the counter. The invitation came casually, almost like a passing suggestion. "We've got a rare collection coming in tonight," she had said over the counter earlier that day. "After hours. I could use a hand sorting them, if you're not in a rush to leave." I wasn't. Not tonight. By the time the library doors were locked, the world outside had gone dark, the streets carrying only a low hum of distant traffic. Inside, the lights were dimmer than usual, just a few desk lamps casting warm pools of gold across the reading tables. Shadows stretched between the aisles, making the familiar space feel more secret, more intimate. She appeared from the back room carrying a stack of aged volumes wrapped in soft cloth. "Careful with these," she murmured as she set them down. "Some of them are older than both of us combined." I smiled, rolling up my sleeves. "Guess that makes them wiser too." She laughed quietly, a low, genuine sound that settled somewhere deep in me. Together we began unwrapping the books, slow work, deliberate. Her fingers moved with reverence, tracing embossed titles, brushing away dust as if waking the past itself. At one point, she leaned closer, pointing out an inscription on the inside of a weathered cover. Her hair fell slightly forward, brushing my shoulder. I caught the faint warmth of her presence, close enough to feel, not close enough to claim. "Look at this," she said, her voice dropping as if sharing a secret. "To the one who read me like a map. Can you imagine? Someone wrote that nearly a century ago." I tilted the page toward the lamplight. They must have meant more than the book. She glanced at me then, long enough for the silence to stretch, not long enough for either of us to break it. The night moved gently around us. Papers rustled, a clock somewhere clicked forward, and the air carried that familiar scent of old paper, polished oak, and her faint lavender. Each time our hands moved to the same stack, our fingers found near contact, a brush of skin, a pause, the small hum of something waiting to be acknowledged. When we finally finished cataloging the last set, she leaned back in her chair, a quiet exhale leaving her lips. "We should file this one under secrets," she said, tapping the cover of the final book with a fingertip. The way she said it wasn't playful this time. It was softer, like the naming of something neither of us had planned, but both had felt. I looked at her then, really looked. The lamplight traced the lines of her face, the calm strength, the hidden tiredness, the softness that only came out in moments like this. She met my gaze without flinching. In that small, dim-lit corner of a sleeping library, I realized we weren't just handling rare books. We were holding something else just as fragile, something that couldn't be catalogued, but would stay with me long after the lights were out. The library was nearly silent when we finished. Outside, the night had deepened, streetlights casting their pale glow through the high windows, painting soft streaks across the polished floor. It was past closing, well past the time either of us should have been here. But neither of us seemed eager to leave. She gathered the last set of keys from the desk, her fingers moving with that same unhurried grace I had noticed the first time I saw her. I slipped on my jacket, watching her from a few steps away, feeling the weight of the quiet settle around us like a familiar blanket. "Thank you for staying," she said at last, her voice low enough to feel rather than just hear. "Not everyone has the patience for this kind of work." I smiled. It didn't feel like work. That earned me a look, not sharp, not playful, but something gentler. She held it for a second longer than needed, as if deciding whether to leave it there or let it mean more. We walked together toward the heavy brass doors. The echo of our footsteps filled the empty hall, a soft duet in the hollow space. At the entrance, she paused, keys in hand, fingers brushing over the cool metal handle before turning slightly toward me. "You know," she said, almost to herself, "some stories aren't meant to be shelved. They're meant to be carried, quietly." I didn't answer right away. The moment didn't need words. The night air pressed faintly at the glass, the scent of rain still lingering from earlier that week. Somewhere outside, a car passed, its headlights trailing briefly across her face, highlighting the softness in her expression, the subtle trace of something unguarded. She placed the keys in my palm for a moment, her fingers curling lightly over mine. A simple gesture, but warm, deliberate. "Lock it behind me?" she asked. I nodded, feeling the brief pressure of her touch. It wasn't just a transfer of keys. It was a quiet exchange, of trust, of presence, of something unnamed but understood. As she stepped past me, her shoulder brushed against my chest, and her free hand lingered there, just above my heart, long enough for me to feel the faintest warmth through the fabric. "Some stories don't need to be told loudly," she whispered. "They just need to be kept, right here." She smiled then, not the polite one from our first meeting, but the real one, the one she'd been holding back. And then she walked out into the night, her figure framed by the doorway, her heels soft against the stone steps. I stood there a while after she was gone, the keys cool in my hand, the library breathing quietly behind me. I didn't know when I'd see her again. But the story had already found its place, not in any catalog or shelf, but somewhere far more private. And like all the best secrets, it didn't need a title to be real.